Hi everyone, this is Jim. I played an interesting game at my local chess club last night. I thought I would share it with you. First of all, let me give you some background on the tournament and the round. So this is actually round 5. It's a 5-round tournament, so it's the final round. The time control was a game in 90 minutes, and with a 5-second delay. The most common time control at the club is game in 2 hours, but they have been alternating lately with the game in 90 minutes time control. It's still pretty slow time control. I had a good start in this tournament. In my first round, my opponent didn't show up, so I got a free point there. That's a forfeit win. Forfeit wins don't count for your rating, but they do count in the tournament standings. Round 2, I took a bye. So after 2 rounds, I was at 1.5 points out of 2. I was traveling that day. Round 3, I actually won. And round 4, I got a draw. So my score was 3 out of 4. And that was actually good enough to put me on board 1 in this final round. Now, there was one player who was doing better. He was at 3.5 points out of 4, but he didn't play the final round. He took a draw. He took a bye that round. So there were actually 4 players at 3-0 who were playing in the final round, and I was one of them. So we were on boards 1 and 2. So my opponent on board 1, well, before I get to that, I just want to mention it's a very rare occurrence for me to be on board 1 in this section of my chess club. In this tournament, it was everyone over 1700 was in the upper section, everyone below 1700 was in the lower section. And so I'm near the bottom of that section, and I usually am struggling just to hit 50%. That's kind of my goal in a lot of these tournaments. So for me to be on board 1 in the final round is, I think this is the first time this happened when I was in the upper section. You can get to board 1 just because of pairings in some of the earlier rounds. It's not as hard, but to be in board 1 in the final round is pretty tough. And of course, I was helped out by that forfeit win in round 1. So anyway, my opponent here was Mike. I'll just go ahead and use his name since I'll be referring to it several times. And he's an original life master. So he has a rating. His current rating is 2209. And an original life master is someone who played over 300 tournament games while maintaining a rating of over 2200. So a strong player and a many-time club champion. My personal record against Mike is 6 losses, 2 draws, and no wins. So anyway, he's got the white pieces. He starts off with knight f3. I play knight f6. This is kind of a waiting move, just waiting to see what kind of setup white has at bind, because white could be going for an English, or he could be going for a Reti. And in this case, white is going for the Reti, or King's Indian attack. So I go d5. He goes bishop g2. I go c6. He castles. And I play bishop to f5. So let's pause here. I mentioned in round 1 that I had a forfeit win. So I was sitting around because my opponent didn't show up. And Mike was also sitting around. His opponent didn't show up in round 1 either. And so we just played a casual game. And he's been playing this system. You know, Mike was traditionally an e4 player. But for the last year or so, he's been playing this knight f3 system, King's Indian attack. And so he played this system against me. And we got to this point in our casual game. And I think I played knight bd2 here. I don't know. I might have played e6 first. I don't remember exactly. But in any case, I ended up with kind of a cramped position. So after our game, I looked it up. And also, I was just kind of improvising with these moves. This knight f6 is my standard reply. You know, I just chose to play d5 and c6 just to see what would happen in that game. But I looked it up afterwards, and it does turn out to be a main line against the King's Indian attack. So this is a system that can be recommended. And now the main move here, there's 2 main moves. One is bishop to g4, and the other is the move I play bishop to f5. So I actually had this move because I had looked it up after our first round game. So I went ahead and played bishop f5. He went d3 here. and it went knight bd7. Now knight bd7 is a rare move. Actually, I didn't look up any further. I mean, if I was a more diligent chess player and researcher, I would have looked up what you're supposed to do after bishop f5. But I thought, well, this is my usual way of learning openings. I learn them kind of one move at a time. I get to the position where I've learned, and then I play it, and then I go up and look up afterwards what I should have done. Anyway, bishop f5, d3, knight bd7. The most common move here is not knight bd7, but rather e6, shoring up the center. And I actually thought about playing e6 here. You know, you're just setting up this very solid bulwark against the bishop on g2. And I decided that was a little bit passive. So I didn't know that e6 was the main move there. I was just improvising here. But my goal when playing this knight bd7 is to get in this e5 move if I can. And although this is a rare move, it seems that it's not bad. So I would play this way again. Nothing terrible went wrong. White went with c4 right away, and I took. My idea in taking is that you know, I don't want to allow him to take and possibly create some kind of weakness, or you know, if I can't take with the knight because he can fork my pieces, so I have to take with a pawn, and then he can just apply more pressure to that pawn, maybe try and get in the e4 move. So now my idea is to take and leave these two pawns here. Once again, kind of a solid, you know, so this bishop is biting on granite. I think that's the right expression. And I'm taking at a moment when he can't really take back with a piece. So we get this symmetrical structure, and I get in the move e5. So I'm pretty happy with the way the opening has gone. I think it's seems to be about even looking at it afterwards, but I think black is doing okay, which is all you can hope for out of the opening, really, especially if you're facing a strong player. So we continue with normal development. I go bishop e7, he goes b3, he's preparing to bring his bishop to b2. I castle, and he played bishop b2. And at this point, we're actually out of the opening book. There is a line here that that turned out well for white, which goes like this. It was knight h4, the bishop goes to g4, queen went to c2, my queen went to c7. You'll see some of these moves in the game. And then the knight hopped into f5. So this is an interesting way to play, maybe encouraging me to trade my bishop for the knight. And the knight is also attacking my bishop here on e7. So bishop to b4 was played, and then bishop b2. And this, well, there was one example game like this in the database, and white went on to win, although I think technically this is still in the range of about even, probably some opening advantage to white, but not white. There's no reason why black should lose from this position. Anyway, let's go back to the game. He played bishop b2 immediately. And this position seems to be about even. So I went queen c7, he went e3, went rook to d8, putting the rook opposite the queen. He went queen e2, can't go to c2 here. And I went h6 now. I think one of the things I did in this game was I held off on this h6 move. It was tempting to play it earlier, because as long as this bishop is stuck out here on f5, it's going to be a target to this knight h4 move, and I wasn't all that sure whether I wanted to go to the g4 square or drop back to e6. I was actually leaning towards the idea of dropping the bishop back to e6, but he never put it to the test. But anyway, I held off on this h6 move as long as I could, because I didn't want to waste a move early in the game. But now it seemed useful to have that retreat square available for the bishop. And well, Mike tested my ideas here right away with knight h4, and I did drop it back to h7. Like I said, I still could have considered bringing it back here, but having played h6, that was really the intent, is to keep it safely out of the way. It's covering, you know, the squares this knight might hop into, and it exerts a little bit of influence on the queen side. But there's also some advantage to keeping it on this diagonal as well, because now white can bring his bishop out to this diagonal at some point. Anyway, Mike decides to close the position with the e4, keep me from pushing on with e5, which I was thinking of, and maybe planning to make a target out of the out of that e5 pawn, which I had to play pretty carefully. One of the points of my queen c7 move, in addition to keeping the knight here, was to maintain good support for that pawn, because he does have this bishop here which is lurking and putting pressure on it, and he can always drop a knight back here and put pressure on it. So it's easy for white to get pressure on that pawn. Let's see. So here I went bishop b4 voluntarily. I'd been thinking about playing this move, knight to c5. Let's paint that in red. And with just the idea of trying to pile up on his e-pawn. And I didn't like the fact that the knight was kind of blocking in the bishop. It's kind of limiting the scope of the bishop. And secondly, I realized that maybe it's an idea just to trade this bishop for this knight, because if I can arrange this trade, that weakens one of the defenders of the e4 square. So I played bishop b4 here, and he kicked it. And having gone this far, I had already decided that I was going to trade. If he kicked the bishop, I wasn't going to retreat. And in fact, I had calculated this line up to this point, and I had planned to play knight c5 here, with the idea that this is a fork. This pawn is loose, and this pawn is under defended. Don't forget that I have the bishop here as well, so I've got 3 attackers and only 2 defenders. So I thought, oh, this is just winning a winning a pawn. And but then I thought to myself, probably Mike would not overlook a simple double attack like that. So what is he going to play when I play knight c5? So I imagined playing knight c5. What he's going to play is this pin, probably, bishop to b4. And now if I have to defend the knight, he can trade it off and mess up my pawns, or just try and put more pressure on the knight, maybe with queen to e3. It did not look all that pleasant to have that pin. But I could take here. I saw this. He could take, and I could take, and we come out materially even. There's 2 pieces hanging. I gained a pawn, but he can get the pawn back by playing bishop takes g7 as a desperado. So I would take, and then he would take. And so, I calculated this position, and I said, this is not something that looks all that attractive to me. He's still got this knight maybe coming in here with a check, although I can trade it off. This bishop seems to be blocked out of the game. But on the other hand, White's bishop is blocked out of the game. White's knight is on the side of the board, and these pawns are a little weaker than my pawns. But, well, my weaknesses are around my king, though. I mean, you've got to take king safety into account as well. If he could somehow distract this knight, maybe he could bring his queen in. Anyway, what I'm leading up to is I decided not to go this route. I actually calculated this exact sequence, and when I was checking it out with the chess engine recommends this line. It says this is what black should play, and it thinks this is best play for both sides. It thinks that I should have played that knight c5 move. It thinks that white should pin it, and I should go down this path of taking the pawns, and it thinks that black is ahead in this position. So that's pretty interesting. But let's back up to the game. In the game, I was faced with this decision of playing knight c5. I'd seen that bishop b4 idea, and I had planned, and I calculated that whole sequence out. But looking at it from this point of view, it didn't, at this point in the game, it didn't look that appealing to me. And so I decided to play something else. So I went with rook to e8. And the idea is now I'm threatening knight to c4. There's no pin, and white has to do something about it. But he plays b4 and just stops me from going for knight c5. So I have to come up with another plan here, and I think I came up with a nice idea here. So if you want to look at this position for a while, see if you can come up with some kind of plan for black. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. You can pause the video if you want some time to think about it. The move I played was c5. So I thought if he took, that I would just take back with the knight. And And then I get my knight to this good square, and it can't ever be chased away. So that seems to be good for me. So I thought his two options were either to push on or maybe just maintain the tension. He could leave the pawn there and maybe bring a rook over or something like that. And then I was going to continue the same way as the game. Anyway, he decided to push, and this is my idea. I played knight to f8, and the knight is coming to this really good square on d4. And I don't think there's anything white can do to stop that. So I was starting to actually feel pretty good about the game at this point. So let's see. He played f3. He's holding up the center with a pawn. It does shut in the bishop, but he has plans to reroute the bishop, and he was probably getting tired of always having to defend that pawn against my pressure. So I went knight to e6. He went bishop to h3. He's just trying to rearrange his pieces here. And I go knight to d4. He's going to reroute this knight around using the g2 square there, and the bishop can sit out on this open diagonal away from the blocked diagonal. But in the meantime, I got a pretty nice piece here in the center of the board that he can't easily chase away. He can always trade it off, of course, for the dark squared bishop. Anyway, here he played queen b2, an interesting move. I think one idea is that if I move this knight away, depending on where I go to, he can maybe take here with the bishop hitting my queen. It's not happening right away. He would need a little more pressure, but anyway, interesting move. And I went, I had to come up with kind of another idea here. So if you want to search for a move for black, this idea is not necessarily great, but it's just you've got to kind of find a way to improve your position at some point. So what would you play in this position? Okay, I'm going to give the answer away. I went knight d7. If you came up with a plan to improve the position of this piece, I think that's probably a valid idea as well. If we back up here, you have to think that these two pieces, you know, one of the ways of coming up with a move is look for your worst piece and find a way to improve it. And both these pieces are not doing very much anymore because they're just hitting on that pawn, which is solidly defended. But I think actually in this case it's useful to keep the bishop here. The pressure on this diagonal turns out to be valuable later in the game. And so I just maneuver around with the knight. I'm trying to find an improved position for the knight. And so it's coming to the b6 square to put pressure on that c4 pawn, or perhaps to hop into a4 to fork the queen and bishop and get rid of this strong bishop here. So he went knight g2. And clearly knight g2 was part of his plan from the beginning, but oddly enough, this move leads to a bit of trouble for white. So let's back up. The best move here, according to the chess engine, is to play a4 here, shoring up the side, and then after I play knight to b6, queen to a2, defending with the queen and threatening to push my knight away. And I think that the chess engine, I think, still likes black a little bit here, but white is certainly doing fine. Anyway, he played with knight to g2. Like I said, that was part of his plan to rearrange those pieces, and it has a good square that it's going to. And when I played knight to b6, it went there. It went to this e3 square, defending the pawn. So he countered my knight maneuver with a knight maneuver of his own, and for a second everything looks good. But there's actually a killer move in this position. And yeah, if you want to figure it out, see if you can spot the idea here. Okay, yeah, pause the video if you want time to think about it. I'm giving the answer away now. The answer is knight a4, and that's the move I played. I mentioned actually I was already planning to play knight a4 because that's one of my ideas, was to just trade off this dark squared bishop. But actually there's a much more dangerous idea here, And while after playing this move, I played this move just because that's what I intended to play. Mostly because that's what I intended to play. I of course made sure it was safe to play and all of that. But as I was looking at it, I noticed he was spending an unusually large amount of time thinking about this. I thought, well, the queen just has to move. But maybe he's trying to figure out the best square, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to take the bishop and he has to take back. But as I was looking at it, I realized, oh, there's a really terrible tactic there. So if you didn't spot the idea earlier, maybe you can spot it now. Okay, here's the idea. Suppose the queen just goes somewhere. Like maybe here, queen to d2, and I take the bishop. Then when he takes back, there's a nasty fork. Loses the whole queen. So in fact, this position is just lost for white. Because after he plays knight e3, I have knight a4 and there's no answer. Let's see, instead of knight e3, he could still go queen to a2, but he'd probably calculated all this far in advance and was just playing through what he had calculated and didn't spot that tactic until he showed up on the radar. This is still good for black. I would continue with a move like f5, trying to use this knight and free up this bishop. So I think this is still good for black, but in knight e3, yeah, just gives away the game. So I played knight a4, and after a long thought, and while he was thinking, I spotted this tactic and I realized he was in big trouble. Relatively best here is actually to give up the queen. Bishop takes, knight takes, bishop takes. He gets 2 pieces for the queen, but this should be winning for black. 2 pieces are just not enough, and there's no other compensation. The pawns are even. Yeah, it can't be good. And you know, queening or allowing taking back the bishop and then allowing the queen to be forked is not good either. So he moved the queen to the side and just let me take the bishop, and now his hope is to perhaps trap this knight. So let's think about this. He pushes the a pawn forward, so now my knight can't come out in this direction. These squares are all covered, so it is a realistic possibility that the knight might get trapped. Of course, the knight can go to this square with check, but from here it doesn't really have anywhere to go. So there's still some life in this position here. I thought about this for a long time. One of the things I'd been thinking about for a while was the idea of sacrificing here on c3. Actually, I'd been thinking about it in an earlier position when he had to take back with the rook, because the idea was knight takes pawn, rook takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, and you know, so I get two pawns for the piece and a strong bishop here. Now I'm thinking about it because of knight takes pawn, queen takes pawn. I could play knight takes this pawn and save that knight. So I would give the piece back, but I would have 2 pawns, and that would be pretty good for me. But I decided I should just try and rescue that knight, not just give up on it prematurely. So I played a6, the idea of you know, exchanging some pawns on the a file here, opening it up, and bringing my rook over to help save that knight. Let's see. So he went king h1 to get away from the potential check, and I went ahead and took here. And actually, right here, you know, I just mentioned this knight takes f3 tactic. This would be actually a good time to take on f3, because in this position you can't even take back. I have this move, so that would have been a good move here. But anyway, I was still focused on saving this knight, so I played a6. He played king h1. I just took. He took back, and then I brought my rook over here to oppose his rook and to save my knight. Excuse me, he took the other way. Yeah, let's back up. So I took, he took with the c pawn, so keeping the a file closed, but still rook a8 is going to rescue that knight. And he went rook f to c1 here, putting pressure on my knight, and then I took. Actually, for a while I was thinking, isn't this good to take with the rook? But then I realized he's got this move here, knight d5, undermining the support of my rook and attacking my queen. And I didn't like the look of that. Looking at it with the chess engine, it turns out this is still okay for black. He's attacking my queen, but I can take his rook, and then this rook is pinned. If he takes back, then I can take his knight. So, and if he takes my queen, I take here with check. And then, let's see, he brings a bishop back to block the check. That's the recommendation. And then I can move this rook. And so, oh, cancel. Rook to d8 was the recommended move. And so what's this? This is, I've got 2 rooks for the queen. And I've got 3 pieces, and he just has 2. So I'm still a piece up, basically, and this knight is a bit out of play. So that line would have worked out okay with rook takes, but I just saw that idea of rook takes a knight here, and I wasn't quite sure all of a sudden. So I took with the knight. This is also good. He played knight d5. I went queen d6. And he brought his bishop back, defending this pawn, I guess, and maybe trying to activate it over here somehow. Played knight to b6, so now my knight is out of trouble, and I'm preparing to exchange as much as I can. He went knight to e3 here, and I took the rook. He took back, and I played rook to a8, and he played knight to c4. And I had played those last few moves, those exchanges, kind of quickly because I had planned them in advance. And so this was another kind of heart-stopping moment. I was worried that, well, if I take his rook, it's no longer with check, so he can take my queen. And if I move my knight, then he can take my rook. Also, that's pretty dangerous. That looks like I'm close to getting mated here. So I need to move my queen, and then he can take my knight. But then I realized that after he takes my knight, I can take his rook. So moving my queen turns out to be okay. It just took me a while to settle down and figure that out. So so he went ahead and traded rooks here. And when he does that, I take back with the knight. So can't take with the queen because that loses the knight, but I stay a piece up here. So he grabs this pawn. I played queen a8. I figured I should try and get a pawn back if I can. He went queen a2, an interesting little trick. Once again, I have to be careful. If I take his knight, he takes my knight with check, and mate. He mates me. I block and he takes. So, but I just played knight to b6, get my knight off the back rank, and also guard the ah square so his queen can't come in and check. Let's see, he pushed f4 now, supporting his knight. I played bishop e4 check. So this bishop, which was lurking here all the time, finally comes into the game when he pushes the f-pawn forward. So when I mentioned earlier that the when I was talking about trying to improve my pieces, the bishop still was playing some kind of role on this side of the board, kind of restraining the pawn. So rerouting the knight was probably the right choice there. Let's see, he went bishop g2, he took, and then he went queen to, oh, it's my turn. I went queen d6, yeah, offering the trade. He declined the queen trade. He went down with queen a7, looking perhaps to check me here. But I noticed also when my queen came out to e6, it was defending the knight, and I decided I didn't mind if he took the b7 pawn because I have queen here check, and I can force a queen trade if he grabs that pawn. Let's see. So I went ahead and played knight takes b5. So there's it's attacking his queen, and the first thing to notice, if he comes here for the check, then I have queen to c8, and the queen has nowhere to run. These squares are covered by my knight. This is covered by the knight. This is covered by the queen and knight, and that's covered by the queen. So this forces a trade. So queen c8 doesn't help. He could retreat here if he wanted to avoid a trade at all costs, but he went ahead and took. And then I played the check, and he resigned after the exchange. I'm just a piece and a pawn up, and although there are some tricks you can play in the endgame and maybe go for a drawn endgame with extra pawns, it requires trading off a lot of pieces. It would be pretty far-fetched. So in this position, White resigned. So that's my first ever win against a master. Even though it was almost an accidental win, you still have these moments you have to take advantage of. So I'm very happy to have gotten that win in. There's lessons from this game. I'd say, one thing is to always approach the game with a good attitude. Don't assume you're going to be defeated. Always look for your opponent's mistakes. And even the strongest player can have an off day. So that's probably what was what was going on here. But in any case, as a result of that win, I have a share of first place. On board 2, there was another decisive game, so the winner on board 2 and myself shared first place in this tournament, and I think that's also the first time that's happened to me at this club. So anyway, a lot of fun. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you later. Bye.